How's everybody doing? You all doing all right? This is a very exciting panel today. We have perhaps one of the most qualified speakers, clearly the best dressed and in a blazer today for us.
I'm a developer, really.
I'm excited because Web3 obviously is very hot right now. There's a lot of different definitions about Web3, but Mike Belshe here has actually managed to not just be around for Web3, he's been around since not just Web2, but Web1 as well.
I guess that's right.
In fact, he's the co-founder of BitGo, a company that you guys probably all know, so I don't need to go too deep for this intro here. But it sits at the core of where institutions really are coming into crypto and getting comfortable with everything right now. And with Web3 being so new, I think it's best to start with Mike Belshe's take on what Web3 is in relation to where we've been in Web1, Web2, and now how we define it here in Web3. So Mike, that'll be the first question. Let's just start by defining what exactly Web3 is in your eyes.
All right, well, thanks, Zach. Let's see, a little bit about my background. So I got started at a very fortunate time in the mid-90s. And I was at Netscape when it was just a small company, kind of Web1 emerging, so to speak. And we were figuring out standards at that time for, how do you create a stateless client to a web server, right? And of course, Mark Andreessen and the Illinois team had started that. But we're just figuring out the protocols we're going to use. So cookies, which, how many of you clicked on accept cookies, right? That was a standard from Lou Montulli out of at a Netscape. We were working that together. By the way, Brendan Eich, also from the Netscape era, is the CEO of Brave Browser, right? But, all right, so Web1 was figuring out how do you make it so that we can use the internet, share all this information. Applications didn't really work. Cookies were a very simple way to save state on the client. Didn't exist in the first pass, right? So these things had to be built. SSL had to be built after that for how do you do secure e-commerce. Nowadays, more about life and death. By the way, first big PKI application was SSL, that's securing the internet. Then we went through Web 2, was kind of the natural evolution there, right? Which is where you have all this information, now how do you organize it? How do you utilize it? How do you get your photos used, right? And of course, social media. So large companies emerged that were able to kind of just take that proprietarily, handle it, and of course they serve it up. That comes with a number of problems, privacy-wise. All right, Web 3. Finally, we get kind of the openness of data, but we're going to be able to control it ourselves. So instead of having to give it up to some other company that's going to organize and manage it for you, you get to control it, and you only have to give away limited pieces of it. And the big underpinning here is really PKI, right? The ability to sign messages, have those authenticated, and then use those in a number of different ways in your applications. So it's exciting. Had I not joined the Netscape, actually, when I did, I was in my mid-20s, I guess, at that point. I would have missed out on the entire internet boom. For all of you guys that are new in your careers, this is the hottest space to be in. Like,
it is.
We are about to take off with a new wave of technology, and it is going to be Web3, among others.
That kind of leads me into the question, too, of timeline of all this, right? So you talk about going from Web1 to Web2, now to Web3, kind of as people start to realize what it unlocks. And you can use, I guess, the simple definition a lot of people choose to kind of orient themselves in Web 1, 2, and 3 is read, write, and read, write, own. And we talk so much about decentralized ownership in Web 3, what that unlocks. Some pushback might be if we're actually going to be able to achieve true decentralized ownership with the stalwarts and maybe big institutions that exist, the powers that be already, maybe getting in early on some of these projects if the access is available to everyone. We're kind of seeing that with a few projects right now. So what's your take on maybe how, I wouldn't want to say protect, how we should be protecting around some of the ownership that Web3 opens, but how do you see that unfolding in this exciting time right now?
Well, look, decentralization is probably the hardest thing to do. And every project starts with a relatively small group. It starts centralized. So even the best laid plans that want to be decentralized have to continually double down and double down again in order to hit decentralization. Now, as we try to bring institutions into the space, which we do want everyone to participate, we want institutions, we want retail, all right, the institutions will naturally kind of pull you back And regulators are not used to a decentralized system, so they don't know how to do it either. These are forces that are going to pull us back to the centralized world. You've also got a lot of people out there to make a quick buck. It's easier to be centralized. It just is, right? And if all you're looking for is making money quickly, you know, that can happen. I think all of us as an ecosystem need to really think hard and continue to double down on decentralization as we go. There will be points where we swing towards centralization, like BitGo, you know, we're considered a centralized custodian, but what's our roots? Our roots are entirely in decentralization. We pioneered this multi-signature component where you hold 2 keys, we hold 1, we can disappear off the face of the earth and you still have your money, right? But then to bring fiduciaries into the mix, well, they can't participate that way. It would be illegal. If anything went wrong for them, they would be on the hook reputationally and fiduciarily. So, all right, so we swing a little bit more towards centralization. Now I got to swing back. Good news is I think Web3, if we can get these standards in place where people agree upon how to use these nuggets of information, how to interact with them, and this is kind of back to like where Web 1 was back in 1994, 95. Those protocols for the very beginnings of it were just getting formed. So we say Web 3 a lot like it exists. It's coming, but we got a lot of protocol work to do, a lot of agreements to have. Yeah.
It's literally being built right in front of our eyes every day. Something new pops up, and it's all quite exciting to watch. So the timeline, you know, I guess is it's ongoing. You can't really say there's a start and finish. But when it comes to institutions, that's the other piece to the title of this panel. And the institution piece, I think, is pretty interesting because, to your point, you need to protect yourself. And I think it's easy when you're operating as an individual. I'm sure there are some DeFi degens in the room where if you lose your money, you know, that's on you, no big deal. But for an institution, it's very different when you're trying to create, whether it's a company or another operating kind of function, to make sure that you're not even going to have an employee maybe run away with funds at the same time. You mentioned the multi-sig capability that BitGo kind of introduces here, but how does that maybe look to institutions as they look at Web3, how they interact with some of these protocols, and what's different for them maybe versus individuals when they're trying to do so?
Well, what is an institution?
We could just sit up here and define. I guess that's what this panel's just defining some of these things today.
Yeah, look, I think the traditional firms are still just trying to get their heads around cryptocurrencies generally. So they've got regulatory constraints that they've got their own biases, they've got huge businesses and people and jobs. There's a bit of the innovator's dilemma happening for them, which they've never experienced before because the financial system's always been protected by this big moat. Now that moat has been breached, all of a sudden, you know, crypto is coming and they're not quite sure what to do about that. So they're still kind of struggling there. When it comes to DeFi and hitting the Web3 components, there's a new element they're worried about, and you know, it often bears its head as the regulatory concerns. I don't think I don't know everybody in this room, but I would bet most people in this room are not interested in money laundering, and most people in this room are not interested in terrorist financing.
Yeah, you should see hands.
Yeah, raise your hand if you want to do those things. Look,
got
like,
one in the front.
We can have DeFi, we can have Web3, we can solve those problems. The solutions that were brought forth, you know, decades ago for how we solve those issues in the traditional finance system, it's hard to say that they actually work.
Yeah.
But the regulator's job isn't to make sure they work. The regulator's job is to enforce the rules that they made up, regardless of whether they work. All right, so with Web3, we can actually make rules that work. We can prove that they work. We can see it. In fact, just a month ago, right? We had Bitfinex hack funds recovered, largest ever recovery. And they didn't have any AML KYC in place at Bitfinex when they were doing that stuff, right? Very limited, right? Anyway, that was all done just thanks to blockchain, right? Just thanks to transparency. So, all right, anyway, back to institutions. Institutions are struggling to get to cryptocurrencies, getting into DeFi and places where they don't see the things that they lean on in terms of regulatory compliance. That's a struggle, but I think it's coming quickly.
The other thing too, obviously we're at an Avalanche conference, so a lot of this, you know, doesn't necessarily need to be Avalanche focused, but you guys did partner in bringing the Avalanche technology to BitGo's wallets, and what I think it's more than $64 billion now BitGo controls or operates.
Yeah, centralized custodian, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, talk to me about what the Avalanche capability, when we talk about scaling all this, right? It's one thing when it really was more on the retail side, but as institutions and major money comes into the space, scalability becomes a pretty important question. And you added Avalanche's technology to BitGo's world. So talk to me about what that unlocks and maybe some of the challenges that are being solved when we think about scaling in the next year, 2 years, 3 years.
Well, in the space generally, right, we do have privacy issues that we're still figuring out. We got protocol issues we're still figuring out. We got scalability issues we're still figuring out. And the great thing about software is you're in this competitive world where all of these different solutions compete to solve these problems. So Avalanche, has really moved the ball down the field in terms of scalability in a big way. And the market is figuring out which of these protocols are going to be used for which applications. So Avalanche, I think, has got a huge role on the go-forward basis. Obviously, our job as a custodian or as a wallet platform, and we provide both non-custodial and custodial options. People think of us as that custodian because it's gotten so big. But the wallet platform is a huge part of it, and of course, our clients have been demanding Avalanche support because they're embedding in a white label way APIs behind the scenes so they can go build their applications on top of the BitGo APIs. And of course, they want Avalanche.
And all of it, too, I guess, all of this gets back to making it as easy as possible for institutions to interact with the crypto world. And you're right in that, the rules just aren't there, so it's a little bit tricky. But to use, your compadre at Galaxy and BitGo's point, Mike Novogratz made this point, when you think about what it does to the overall space in terms of the money that's sucked in. At $2 trillion, the market cap of crypto right now is roughly about, 30 basis points of total wealth. And to get to 2-3% of that, you need institutions to come along. And so I guess some of those pain points that are already being solved in your conversations with your institutional clients, what are you seeing there, I guess, that's even changed in the last year to kind of point to the accelerating adoption for institutions now looking to get into crypto?
Well, the institutions have been kicking the tires in a couple of different waves. It started back in 2017, as the ICO craze kicked off. And they kind of looked around at crypto and they didn't see the safety that they needed. There's too much, single counterparty risk that they had to worry about, single vendor risk. So they kind of mostly backed away. Now we kept building, right? And come 2019, 2020, suddenly they started to see an environment where they can participate. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is starting to separate some of the market structure functions. And without replicating the market structure that you have in the equities world or in the CFTC and the futures contracts world, we can start to make security improvements completely consistent with how we do DeFi type protocols, but where you separate function of trading and holding the asset. Because whenever you have a single party that you're reliant on for all parts of managing your funds, you're just one step away from abuse at some point. And a core part of security is eliminating single parts of failure. The market structure we use in crypto today is these verticalized stacks. So anyway, the institutions are very excited about that. I'm more excited about what we do when we get to DeFi, and it's no longer, centralized exchanges, centralized custodians, et cetera, and instead, we're actually just dealing with the protocols directly. But the institutions are a little bit farther away on that one, mostly on regulatory now.
Yeah, and when we think about, I guess, other proof points, they are popping up, I think, at least when I watch it. I'm not sure about everybody else watching these things pop up now, but it does seem like it's accelerating in terms of the ways institutions previously, and probably no surprise, thought about things in kind of a top-down structure, since that's the way they've been built. As you said, they kind of start decentralized if it's just one guy with an idea, but then evolves into a company that's run in a very top-down mind. But you do see some VCs out there. You can talk about Bessemer's move to launch what they want to call a DAO, admittedly starting out a centralized DAO, which is kind of, antithetical, a bit oxymoronic there, but with the goal of becoming not just a centralized, decentralized, autonomous organization, but a true DAO at some point through their investments. And I guess, that gets back to the question of decentralization in this Web3 world, whether or not you think it's compatible for an institution like that, these institutions that are run, to truly decentralize, or if it's really something you're going to have to see something started from day one set up with all of those protocols in mind to be decentralized? Kind of, if it's possible for a centralized organization to ever truly, really pull it off.
Well, is it possible to incubate a company when it's small, have it grow through its Series A, its Series B, its Series C, and eventually an IPO in a productive way? I think it is, right? So those that invest early in technologies and teams and products, of course they're going to be wanting to make money on the other side of it. And that may feel like centralization. And I think we do have to be a little bit concerned about how many people are really participating in a given token. I think one of the things people misestimate over and over again is what it means to have a thin market. So when you start out and you can instantly create a company and instantly create a token that represents it, now you got a thin market that's trading it, and that thing can swing incredibly fast. And I think it's really hard for humans to get their heads around it. So I think where that centralization becomes kind of scary is like, well, those guys can move the market all on their own. And of course we've got these large foundations that are sitting on huge amounts of asset. What happens if they decide to use it in a way that's different than what they had originally set up? It's kind of like, look at Google's evolution. And when Larry and Sergey were running the company, they had this phrase, do no evil, right? And people loved it because they had a really simple user interface. We were all kind of happy about it. Well, they kind of moved on from the company. It's gotten to be a little bit more corporate now. Kind of that face, that human part of it is gone. If you'd gone back in time and you said, hey, do you trust Larry and Sergey running this company? Most people are like, yep, we trust them. And then you say, well, do you trust whoever's going to run it in 10 years? I don't know if I trust them, right? So anyway, with DAOs and things like that, you've got governance. You've got to figure out a way to get that decentralized. Those early investors, of course, they're going to take a piece so that they can have the success that they're looking for. That means you got to trust them now. You got to trust them to actually continue down that decentralized path. That's the hard part.
Yeah, and I guess in a world where maybe it's optimized in the short term, where there are a bunch of get-rich-quick schemes or people looking to kind of maybe make money really quickly, it's hard to focus on the longer-term vision of all that stuff, especially if you're not sure who's going to be around to run it. We've got about 3 minutes left on this one. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I want to squeeze in a question on some of the risks before we wrap up on a positive note. Some of the risks that you see now as we kind of move into Web3, things that maybe are starting to pique your interest for things that people should be watching.
Yeah. I mean, it's on the same theme of like staying true to decentralization. So one example is clearinghouses. We've got custodians and wallet providers, applications, et cetera. There's a lot of software guys looking to become like the future clearinghouse. Now, the blockchain technology we have, like we can settle things on chain. We know how to do this cryptographically, and we can build that. But it means we have to build a protocol. We have to get everybody to agree on how to do it, and then we have to start using it. And if we don't do that really fast, the temptation to lean on a clearinghouse, a central party to do it, just becomes too easy, right? And next thing you know, a centralized party has been introduced, and we're all dependent on it for getting money between this app and that app, or this exchange or that exchange. Anyway, I think that's one of the big risks we're at right now, which is like we really need teams that are going to continue to invest in how to make it decentralized through the whole stack.
All right, let's end on the positive note here then too. When we talk about kind of institutional adoptions that we're seeing play out in Web3, like you said, the hottest space to be in any sector, any technology, anywhere in the world is Web3. Second hottest place, I suppose, is right here at the Avalanche Summit in Barcelona. When we're talking about where things go from here, in our last minute to wrap things up, how do you see it accelerating? Kind of, what's the next year look like for crypto? I know it's hard to predict where prices go, but I guess when you can kind of pair with the accelerating rate of adoption now, particularly when it comes to institutions, how do you see the space evolving to the point of crypto actually establishing itself in solving not just some DeFi degen stuff, but real problems getting solved right now? That's what I'm personally most excited about, to see the technology really now move into a phase of affecting real life, which of course also good that the number goes up.
Well, I've said a couple times recently, I'm not sure that kind of a depressed time period on price wouldn't be a good thing for us. There's a lot of dedicated people probably in this room that want to continue to build. And you hit on a point earlier about, Mike Novogratz and institutions versus retail. Look, we need everybody to be able to participate in these systems. And when you get to a certain amount of asset being held, that means you do have some obligation to make sure that you can pass it on to your family if you should die, or pass it on to the other people in your company, et cetera. So there's a lot of building to be done, and the price is a distraction. When I was at Netscape after it went public, Jim Barksdale, the CEO, he came out one day and he said he didn't want anybody talking about the stock price, right? He didn't want anybody in the company looking at that. You can do that at home, whatever. It's just a distraction. And in a way, we have the same issue here, but it's at a global level. So I would like it if we didn't have a big distraction, although, of course, long term, it's inevitable. The price of the assets are going to go up because we're going to continue to build, we're going to replace financial systems, and it's just going to be better.
Yeah, this is what we were talking about before we hopped up on stage, is that sometimes it's better to just not look at the daily moves and just long-term hodl. But of course, y'all already know that. Mike Belshe, everybody, appreciate you sticking around to watch.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.